Hi, everybody. My name is Ruth Burr, and I am the VP Strategy at Upbuild. And today I'm going to be talking about how you can hack your tracking using Google Tag Manager. So, how is everyone's October going? Mine is going okay. I was feeling really good about this talk. I had a lot of really fun event tracking via Google Tag Manager that I was going to share with you. And then about 2 weeks ago, Google launched GA4. They launched the new Google Analytics on October 14th, which is cool in many ways. However, it has changed some of the things that I was going to talk about in this talk for a few different reasons. The main one being that event tracking in GA4 is fundamentally different than how it was in Universal Analytics. Specifically, GA4 events no longer have category, action, and label. Instead, they have either built-in or custom parameters. And there are some other differences to event tracking that are going to impact some of the tracking philosophy that underpins what I'm going to talk about today. However, most of what I'm going to talk about today is useful in either Universal Analytics or GA4. But just an FYI, I'm going to try to cover most as best I can to do both. So let's dive right in. Now, I'm going to assume that if you are viewing this presentation, that you already are somewhat familiar with Google Tag Manager. So I'm not going to go super in depth on basic Google Tag Manager uses and terminology. But one thing that I do want to make sure to define up front, because we're going to talk about it more later, is the document object model, or the DOM. The document object model is basically a representation of all of the objects that make up the structure and the content of a document on the web, such as a web page. So that's the code, it's the content, it's the scripts, it's the fonts, it's all of the different pieces that make up a document on the web. The DOM is sort of a tree-like visualization representation of those objects. And we talk about the DOM a lot in Google Tag Manager, so I wanted to make sure to cover what that is up front so you're not confused in case you didn't know. Now, when we're embarking on a new tracking adventure, I think a lot of times it's really tempting to start out and say, okay, what are the metrics that I want to track? Especially as marketers, we get really into kind of a groove with what we're tracking, and we start thinking about tracking from a KPI perspective. And I find it really valuable to actually take a step back at the beginning of a new project and say, okay, what information do I need? In a perfect world where I could know anything about how people use this website, what would I know? And then what would I do with that information? And if I don't have a clear answer to both of those things, especially what am I going to do with this information, that's a sign to me that that KPI may not actually be that valuable to me to track. So start out with what you want to know and how you want to use your data. Then reverse engineer back from that the pieces of data, the KPIs and metrics that you're actually going to track in order to answer those questions and do the things that you want to do. So you sit down, you do this, you think about everything you want to track, and then because you're a marketer, you create a beautiful spreadsheet. We're SEOs, we all love spreadsheets, myself included. And what you're going to want to do at this point is really think about your data hygiene and your data governance. You want to plan out all of the events that you're going to track and the parameters you're going to pass with them. So in UA, that's category, action, label, and sometimes a value. And what I like to do at this stage, and I think this is going to be valuable in GA4 as well, is establish not only what the parameter values are going to be for the things I know I want to track now, but also some rules for how anyone else in my organization could figure out what those same parameters would be on new events in the future. The more you can make it really specific, okay, our category is always this, our action is always this, etc., the higher likelihood that someone in the future who's not you is going to implement events correctly, and that events are going to be implemented consistently enough that you're able to compare them and derive insights from comparing them to each other. Now, in GA4, there are a lot of built-in events. And so a lot of that is going to be way easier to do because you're not going to have to custom implement everything that marketers now use event tracking to track. There are a lot of automatically collected events, and then there are some, it's called enhanced measurement, and some recommended events, all of which come with built-in parameters. So implementing those, you know that you're going to be on the same page, not only as anybody else in your organization, but also anybody else using GA4 at other organizations, which is cool and will result in a lot of great new methodologies, I'm sure. The trade-off there is that whereas Universal Analytics has just the 4 parameters you can populate, GA4 has up to 25 custom parameters that you can pass per event. And those can be anything. So your custom parameters can go off the rails if you're not careful. So this kind of planning and data governance is important. The other thing to keep in mind is that in UA, you can track as many events as you want. The only real limit is that as you're tracking more and more events, you are going to start running into some performance issues with latency. So you do want to be aware of how much information you're passing on a given page view or click, etc. With GA4, there actually are now limits on the number of custom parameters you can have. You can have 50 numerical and 50 text custom parameters per project, which in this case is a property in Google Analytics. What's really a bummer about this, although I understand why they're doing it this way, is that the same parameter for 2 different events counts as 2 custom parameters, not 1. So again, this planning process becomes even more important with GA4, both because you can call your parameters whatever you want, so you need to figure out what those are in terms of custom parameters, and also because you are limited to how many you want to track. If you want to read more about this, there is a link to, went too far. There is a link to a Google developer blog post on implementing your existing UA events as GA4 events. And as you can see, even just from this documentation, it's clear that they don't really want you to create custom events. Then that's part of why they've created these new built-in events. So check it out. It may be that GA4 already tracks everything that you want to track, but if not, we're going to talk about what we can do next. Speaking of features that come standard on all models, a lot of event tracking is something that you can do in GTM without hacking. And I think a lot of marketers are still really underutilizing the out-of-the-box functionality of GTM. If you are going to be using GTM to deploy a lot of events, I do recommend looking into server-side tagging for GTM. I'm not going to go into that today, but I've linked here to an explainer from Cardinal Path on what that is and why you might want to do it. It will help mitigate some of those performance issues that come with tracking a lot of stuff. To me, the beauty of Google Tag Manager when it first launched was that before Google Tag Manager, in order to do event tracking in GA, you had to hard code it. And that meant getting developers involved. It meant event tracking was hard to implement and hard to change. Now, and I say now, it's been years at this point with GTM, event tracking can all be done within the GTM interface. And the other thing that I really like about GTM is that instead of hard coding or having static values for things like your category, action, or label, you can actually use dynamic parameters, variables, in order to populate these parameters. So a variable is the same thing in GTM that it is anywhere else. It's just a piece of data with a name. And in this case, the piece of data is category, and then you just tell it what the variable is. The same thing is true in GA4. So variables are still useful. You can actually go in now if you're using GTM and look at the GA4 event setup, and you can see once again, you can use variables both for your event name and your event parameters. Because parameters in GA4 can be anything, the custom parameters, you do have to take one extra step with GA4 that you didn't with Universal Analytics, which is to enable custom parameters in Google Analytics as well as in GTM. And tell them, among other things, is this text or a number, which will indicate the kind of reporting that you can do with it. But other than that, you can still dynamically populate those variables in GTM, which is great. Like I said, GA4 comes with a bunch of built-in events and a bunch of other extra events that you can just implement, so check that out. Google Tag Manager also comes with a ton of built-in variables, many of which are things that you might want to capture as an event parameter. And again, I see a lot of marketers really, really underutilizing the wealth of existing variables available in GTM. So if you haven't looked at it lately, take a look at the things that you can track in GTM and see if what you want to track is already something that you can just do. Another thing that I see people really underutilizing in GTM is regular expressions. You can regex the crap out of a GTM trigger or a tag, and a lot of people aren't doing this. And using regular expressions gives you a lot more granularity, a lot more flexibility, a lot more options in GTM the same way it does anywhere. A word of caution when you are bringing things into Google Analytics anytime, especially with some of the methods that we're going to be talking about today. Watch out for personally identifiable information, PII, names, email addresses, phone numbers, even things like titles and company names count as PII. You should not pass this into Google Analytics. Depending on where you live, it might be illegal. It's also morally wrong. If you don't care about either of those two things, you should know that If Google Analytics finds PII in your analytics property, they may delete the whole thing and your data will be gone and you will be very sad. So if you don't care about legality or morality, care about the fact that you might lose your data. So built-in functionality can already get us pretty far, but we're marketers and we like to have fun and we like to soup things up and use things in ways that they may not have been intended to use. And so let's talk about some of the things we can do. The thing to remember about Google Tag Manager is that yes, it is a tag management system, and a lot of people just use it for that. They're just using it to implement their, tracking pixels and third-party tools and things like that. But GTM is also a really easy way to inject JavaScript onto a page or into a website. And that it really increases the amount of things we can track. You can do a lot of things with GTM and its custom HTML and JavaScript capabilities, but today we're going to focus mostly on tracking. One of the things that you can do that makes GTM so useful is you can push things into a data layer. For those of you who don't know what a data layer is, you can think of a website. There's the experience layer. That's everything that a user might interact with. It's the content, it's the pictures, it's the links, it's anything they can click on. That's what they experience. And that experience layer is driven by the application layer. That's our database, it's our CSS. It's all of the information that doesn't need to appear on the page in order for the user to have a good time, but does need to be underneath in order for the website to function. In between those two, we can insert a layer called the data layer, where we can push information from the application or the experience layer, depending on user actions or website events, such as a page load or a DOM load, and then take that information out and do things with it. The way that I like to explain a data layer to lay people is it's like a pocket. You can put anything in a pocket at any time. So as a user walks around the site, you can put stuff in their pocket. The user can't see it because it's in their pocket, but you can pull things out of your pocket and use them at any time. So think of your data layer as your data pocket. Put stuff in and pull it out and use it. Your website may or may not already have a data layer on it. It is something you have to put on your website if you don't already have one. However, most Google Tag Manager implementation plugins have some kind of data layer implementation option as well. So at Upbuild, we tend to use this one. It's called Google Tag Manager for WordPress. It does what it says on the tin. And in addition to implementing GTM pretty well, it also has an option for you to implement a data layer too. So you can do that via plugin. You may not need to get a developer involved. And the basic anatomy of a data layer push is you say data layer.push. Then you push in an event and you push in variables and what those variables values might be. You can push whatever you want into the data layer, but if you want to get it back out of GTM, you need to use an event key in order to trigger the tag in GTM. Also, otherwise GTM is not going to know where to find or what to do with this information. So as a best practice, always use an event key when you're pushing things into the data layer for GTM. And now what we can do with GTM is we can populate those custom variables with just about anything. And in order to find the information that we want to track, the first thing we need to find is that piece of information's unique selector. So this is an example. This is the top nav for the Upbuild website. And it is the only thing on this page I know that has an unordered list that has the ID of menu, main menu. So I can use that selector in order to track either the load of or interactions with that list. However, sometimes CSS is not specific enough. So here you can see we've got two different buttons on the Upbuild homepage. Both of them have a class of button large. If I want to track clicks on one and not the other, tracking it by CSS class will not work. If you're using jQuery, I like to use jQuery alongside GTM for a lot of stuff. Many websites are built with jQuery. If they're not, you can actually use GTM to inject it. But if you are using jQuery, you can use a browser extension called jQuery Unique Selector, which will help you find a unique selector. And a lot of times you will need to use some kind of plugin in order to find a selector. And sometimes those can get really specific and kind of gnarly. So as you can see, this is the selector for just the homepage on upbuild.io. Sorry, just the contact us button on the homepage. And it is a little bit gnarly. It's got hat tags, it's got carrots, it's got parentheses, it's got all kinds of things in it. It's very specific. So play around until you can find the unique selector of exactly what you want to track. Because the truth is, anything with a unique selector can be tracked using Google Tag Manager. Either you can pull that information out into a variable and name the variable something. And then anytime that, once you set up this custom JavaScript variable, anytime Google Tag Manager finds that piece of information on the page, they will say, okay, here's that variable and here's its value. You can then use that for whatever you need to use. If you're using jQuery, or there are other ways to do this. I'm going to talk about jQuery today. You can also track interactions with things with unique selectors in the DOM. Interactions or jQuery event handlers are things like click, also things like form submit or hover or change. There are a bunch of different ones, so you can look them up. But using a combination of GTM, custom JavaScript, and jQuery, you can track interactions on just about any element of your site with a unique selector that can be interacted with. And the way that historically I've been using this that isn't really as valuable anymore, but we're going to talk about it today, is tracking clicks, so tracking the click stream. So here's an example. I start out my script. I say, okay, let's look at the main menu. And for each of the links in that menu, when someone clicks on it, we're going to push a KPI event into the data layer. We've got our custom variables for category, action, and label. Some of those have static values. Some of them I'm actually grabbing the text of the link dynamically and populating the variable with that. And then I close up all of my tags. And so what I've done is I've pushed a KPI event, I've pushed a Google Analytics event into the data layer. At this point, I haven't actually tracked anything because you can't just push things into the data layer, you have to get them back out in order to track them. So to do that, we have to do a few extra steps. One, we have to set up our variable in GTM so that it knows what to look for. So we have to do that for each of our custom variables that we're pushing into GTM. Again, with GA4, there's the extra step where you also have to register that in GA. Then we have to set up a trigger, so it looks for that custom event and knows when to fire. And then we set up a second tag. So there are two tags now, one to push it in, one to get it back out. This tag is just a classic event tracking tag. And we just say, okay, look for these variables and populate this GA event with those variables and push it into GA. And that is how we're actually taking that information out of the data layer and tracking it. Now, the main way that I have historically been using this particular methodology is for clickstream tracking, which is awesome, except that now in GA4, clickstream tracking is automatically included, which is also awesome. However, it does mean that this presentation is less useful if you're going right to GA4. If you're not want clickstream tracking, this is a great way to do it. There are a lot of other things that you can do with custom JavaScript variables in GA4 or Universal Analytics besides click tracking, though. You can use that same methodology, those same custom JavaScript variables to populate custom parameters in either analytics instance. So let's talk about some other things that you can do with that. One thing to keep in mind is that because we're using JavaScript, we're not limited to an individual value when we're populating a variable. It's actually possible to populate variables with a JavaScript array and have multiple pieces of information rolling up into one variable. I've linked here to a great explainer on how to do that over at Mixed Analytics. Check that out. But there are a lot of different uses that an array can have as a variable. One of my favorite is using that change handler in jQuery to look at what form fields different users click on a form before they abandon the page. So this is an event that we fire only if somebody starts filling out a form and then leaves the page without completing it. At that point, so we're pushing the data into the data layer as they're filling out the form. If they don't complete it and abandon, we then fire an event that pushes in and tells us, you can see we're not passing the information they entered, because that would be PII, but the fields that they interacted with, so we can start to get a sense of what fields are putting people off. Another thing that you can do using custom JavaScript variables is set not only event parameters, which I know I've talked about a lot today, but you can use variables because they're so tied into GTM to configure things like your triggers as well, things like your event names, all kinds of different things. What this is great for is if you only want to fire an event sometimes, for example, based on the value of a variable, you can set that trigger to only fire that event if the specific circumstances that you want to fire it under happen. So in this case, it's only if somebody enters a number between 1,000 and 49.99 on this form. And this is from our example of how to score leads in Google Tag Manager, which you can read if you feel like it. I know a lot of people are using GTM to set custom dimensions in UA. I think that's really great. I think a lot of people are still underutilizing this functionality. It's so easy to collect a piece of information and set it as a custom dimension in Universal Analytics. And there are a lot of applications of this. My favorite is that it is a really easy way to track whether or not users are logged in. Those behaviors are so different. It's really nice to track them using a custom dimension. Now you'll notice here that when I'm pushing something into the data layer, I am pushing an event called page view. You might be thinking to yourself, okay, well, page view is a built-in trigger in GTM, and this is not how it works. When you are using something that you're pushing into the data layer to set a custom dimension, you might not want to use the built-in page view trigger to pass that dimension because the data layer push is often going to happen after the page loads. So if you trigger that custom dimension on page view, the data layer may not have had a chance to push that information in, and you'll see a lot of like not set values in your reports. So instead, create a custom page view event that you're pushing into the data layer along with the information that you're going to set as a custom dimension, and then use that as the trigger to get it back out and set the custom dimension. One thing that you can do with GTM is you can overwrite fields in Google Analytics. And there are a lot of reasons to not do this because it can mess up your data. But one really great way to do this is, one really great use of this is to strip out personally identifiable information. So what you can do is create a JavaScript variable that receives the query string, and then instead of just saying, okay, you may have noticed earlier with setting up a JavaScript variable, you say, okay, go get it, and then return it. Instead, you say, go get it, and instead of returning it verbatim, you are going to return it verbatim unless it contains an @ sign, which means it probably has an email. You're going to replace that with email removed. Or if it contains a 13 to 16 digit number, which is probably a credit card number, you can replace that parameter with CC removed. And that will strip out those two parameters while keeping the rest of the query string intact. So that's the most common source of PII in Google Analytics, is information that's been passed along in the URL as part of a query string with a form submission. If that's happening to you, you can at least strip out email and credit card. And if you start seeing these, then you can go in and see what's happening and try to remove that without already having stored that PII in that property. So that's really nice. And you can use that to overwrite the page field in your Google Analytics tag. So it'll be returning the same thing unless these parameters are present, in which case it'll strip them out. It's really fun. In that same vein, you can use custom JavaScript via Google Tag Manager to put in, if your site search functionality doesn't use a query parameter, you can't track it out of the box in UA. I don't know if that's going to be the case in GA4 or not, but you can use GTM to sort of trick Google Analytics into thinking that you do have a query parameter, and you can then optimize that site search tracking in Google Analytics. These are just some of the many things that you can do with GTM. I could go on all day, and a lot of these aren't even new. They're just cool. And what I really want for you to take away from this is that Google Analytics is something that you can pass a lot of data into. And by using GTM and using just a small amount of JavaScript, you can really have a lot of granularity over what information you are tracking and how you're tracking it. And the last thing I will say is I know a lot of you are using GTM to set cookies. And that's great, but don't forget, you're allowed to set your own cookies. I see a lot of people using GTM to set third-party cookies. You can set first-party cookies too. If you want to dabble in personalization, if you want to start setting cookies and you've already got your GDPR protection set up because you're already setting cookies for other tools, start setting them for yourself and see how you can change your website to better serve your users' needs. So there's a lot of information in a short amount of time. So I will be around in the eventee to answer questions. I love geeking out about all of this stuff. So thanks for having me, DFW SEM State of Search. Holler at me here or at Upbuild or on Twitter, and have a wonderful day.